So welcome to the final in the series of classes on God and science. So as usual, I've got enough material here for about 6 more years of classes, but we'll see what we can cover today. And then we'll have a little time to see if anybody has any questions about anything that's been presented. So I want to start by continuing something that I had meant to include in the last class but didn't have time to get to. So in the Kabbalah, at the very top above the tree of life, there's something called Ein Sof, and it represents the ineffable aspect of God, which is beyond beingness and qualities. And it said that the light returns to this, and in other traditions this is referred to as being the deep sleep of God. And the Sufis say that light, new creation reemerges at every instant. So we could say that this light emerges from the deep sleep of God into the next instance of creation. And in Hinduism, they talk about existence being the dream of God. And Pir Vilayat, who was our teacher, Diane and my teacher in the Sufis for many years, would describe this as being the thinking of God or the divine programming, which is constantly changing, and is changing based on the input and the experience and the feedback of everything that's in creation. So scientists have talked about the universe being like a giant cosmic hologram, and so if we think of the totality as being the divine hologram, it's always changing from the realization of created beings. And this furthers the process of evolution taking place. So let's look at it from the level of the individual soul and manifestation. So when a person awakens to the capacity to enable what you might call a meeting place between their manifest or human aspects and their divine aspects, then something new emerges from that meeting place. And one way of looking at this is we could say that we've enabled the divine being, the dreamer of existence, to have a lucid dream. So some of you may know what lucid dreams are. This is when you awaken in a dream and you realize that you're dreaming, but you don't wake up, and then it's pretty cool. You can change it into anything that you want. So let's take this at a cosmic level. When a human enables the divine to awaken in creation through them, then the divine dream can be consciously changed so that new evolution of the divine being can take place. So we'll swing back to the science side of things. Remember, we talked about Seth Lloyd saying that the universe is a gigantic quantum computer, and what is it seeking to compute itself? It's seeking to understand itself. And a furtherance of that, in artificial intelligence, they're working on systems that can learn and learn beyond just the basic instructions of the programming. So for instance, IBM has this computer called Deep Blue that recently beat the world's chess champion, much to the champion's frustration, because afterwards he looked at some of these moves and he says these don't make any sense what the computer was doing. I mean, it wasn't logical because he could probably see 8 or 10 moves ahead, but the computer could see just millions and millions of possibilities. So computer programs have already been designed to become what are called expert systems, where they can do things as well as, or in some cases better than human beings can do them. Okay. So we're actually furthering the divine consciousness by awakening in existence. We're enabling new possibilities to take place. Okay. Now, this whole series has been called God and Science. And we've been talking about how our concept of God historically has been greatly influenced by the ideas of science at the time. So I want to read you a quote from Hazra Inayat Khan talking about the presence of God. Then there is a third person who has imagination, which is strengthened by faith. He not only prays to God, but he prays before God in the presence of God. Once imagination has helped a person to bring the presence of God before them, God is awakened in their own heart. Then, before they utter a word, it is heard by God. When they are praying in a room, they're not alone. They're there with God. Then to that person, God is not in the highest heaven, but close to them, before them, in them. Then to that person, heaven is on earth, and earth is in heaven. No one is then so living, so intelligible as God, and all names and forms disappear before Him. Then every word or prayer they utter is a living word. It not only brings blessing to them, but to all those around them. This is similar to something that Ibn Arabi talked about hundreds of years ago, where he talked about the importance of humans developing a relationship with what he called their personal Lord or their personal God, as opposed to what he called, and this is before Supreme Court rulings, I won't get into it, what he called the corporate God, where the Supreme Court said corporations or people and so on. But the corporate God, he meant just kind of the generic notion of God, as opposed to someone creating their own ideal of what God means to them. And I would say in terms of this series of classes, whether or not a person is religious or can even relate to the idea of God, I would substitute how they relate to the larger reality in which they exist. Because I don't think anybody, even the most hardened atheist, would dispute the fact that we exist in a reality much larger than what's usually available to the physical senses, even if all they would agree to is, well, there's the rest of the electromagnetic spectrum, or nowadays, well, there's the quantum vacuum, which we're trying to understand, and so on. But there's a deeper structure of reality than what usually meets the eye. So whatever point of view that you're coming from, it's important, I think, to have a working metaphor for how you're fitting in with the bigger picture of things. And in addition to having a metaphor, a sense of, well, what's your purpose? What's your desire? What are you wanting? And for a scientist, it might be, well, I'd like to understand more about fill in the blanks, the nature of the laws of physics. Or our son is a molecular biologist. He's wanting to understand the deep structure of a particular cell called a neutrophil, the mechanisms inside. But what is it that you're seeking to unfold? What's the passion of your being? And coming back to something that Ibn Arabi said, that each of us has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no one else has ever had access to. Well, not only how can you help to unfold that potential wisdom, but how can you help to further that wisdom from beyond what was there to start with, or the potentialities of what was there to start with. So I talked, I think, in the first class, first or second class, about, I think it's outdated notion, the typical way that I think probably all of us grew up hearing about God omniscient, omnipresent, all-pervading, and probably unchanging, something that's not really affected by what goes on in existence, but what's in existence can transform so it can go back to God or get closer to God, or however that you look at it. And now, thinking both of people in theology, or many people in theology, as well as science, is that we live in a constantly evolving universe, that everything is totally, deeply interconnected with, and everything is having an impact on everything else in the universe. And so if we're seeking to further that process of awakening to our own wisdom, and that's probably a driving force on our spiritual journeys, where we'd like to know more about who I am, what's God, what's this deeper reality, then we want to engage in a process that's going to help do that. But in the process of doing that, what starts as, or what we think of as beginning as a journey perhaps solely for our own fill-in-the-blank, awakening, enlightenment, salvation, liberation, resurrection, transformation. Different traditions have different words to describe what happens to us, and oftentimes they have a destination in mind. In Buddhism, nirvana. In yoga, the highest state is called nirvikalpa samadhi, which means without seed, which means you've shed any essence of individual identity or uniqueness, and you've just dissolved in the cosmic, undescribable ocean of bliss. Well, I think that to me is, I mean, it's one way of looking at why there's an existence, but to me it's a much more fulfilling way to think about the purpose of everything is to further wisdom, to further what can happen with the relationship between what exists in any level of manifestation, which includes physical manifestation, but also subtle levels of reality. Some of you may have gone to hear Brian Greene's talk, and he was talking about the theory that there's 10 dimensions, and so cosmologists and physicists really believe that there are many more dimensions than the 3 dimensions of space and time. And of course the mystics for thousands of years have said, well, there's definitely other dimensions, and there's different names. So the physicists might call it the 5th dimension or the 9th dimension, and the mystics might call it this level of heaven or the level of the angels or archangels or this or that, but they're really all describing different aspects of the one reality. And the descriptions of that reality are filtered through the language, the beliefs, and the terminology of the particular system. So if it's science, of course it's going to be in the language of science and trying to reconcile gravity and quantum physics. And if it's mysticism, it's trying to have some kind of coherent system that talks about the relationship between these different strata of reality that our tendency is to think of as, well, this one's here and this one's higher than that one, like they're stacked up. And it takes a real shift in our thinking to realize none of these are any place else but right here, but here is so much more than what we think it is and what we've come to know it is with our consciousness so far. So what awakening is, initially we tend to think, well, I'm going to raise my consciousness. I'm going to get to a higher state of consciousness. And oftentimes when that happens, and many people have had mystical experiences, whether it's through a particular spiritual pathway or sometimes spontaneous experiences, and generally those seem so different from the usual state that you feel very high, and when you come back from it, you have a feeling you were someplace else, and it's usually very wonderful, and you'd like to find ways to get back to there. But part of the problem with our usual way of thinking is it's not there, it's nowhere else but here, but we've only accessed a filtered out portion of our existence. So it'd be like walking around with rose-colored glasses and everything looks rose-colored, and if we didn't know we had the glasses on, we would think that's the way that things are. So let me pause here and see if there's any questions so far. So today I'm trying to do the, at least for now, big wrap-up, but there's certainly more to be said. Anybody have any questions? Okay, good. You've all expanded your dimensions. Okay, so I want to read you something. I may have read this last time, but I think it's a really good metaphor. I've talked many times about the fact that we exist in an interconnected reality, whether or not we are aware of it or believe in it. And so what does it mean to awaken in this interconnected reality? So this is from Laszlo, the self-actualizing cosmos, and he's got the metaphor of the sea and the waves. We refer to the sea, if there's no wind or other disturbance, its surface is still and smooth. But as soon as something perturbs the surface, waves appear on it. These waves are not separate realities, they are part of the body of water. They are its surface manifestations. So I'll put a little my aside here. We are surface manifestations of the deeper reality, or you could say God. We're the manifest aspects of God, as well as we are the manifest. If you're familiar with computer games, online, or not necessarily computer games, it could be chat rooms, and many times you can create some character that's moving around and interacting, and what are those characters called? They're called avatars. So we are the, I would say, potential avatars of the divine being, and in Hinduism, avatars are like God incarnate. This is, I am God, this, and so on. But I say that what those avatars are, those are beings who have fully realized their potentiality to function as a human-hybrid, human-divine being, so that the divine can have the fullest experience of him, herself in life, but the human, who's the avatar, can have the fullest possible experience of that larger reality. So it's like the most that can come through. So we're all, I would say, hatching avatars. Okay. And we don't have to just be in computer simulations. Okay, back to Laszlo. The waves are not separate realities, they are surface manifestations. If we concentrate on the waves, we see wave trains propagating, interacting, and creating complex patterns. Yet the waves are patterns produced by the body of water that makes up the sea. The waves are not in or on the sea. Now think about this, because usually we think, oh, here comes this wave. This wave is moving. But the whole sea is arising and arising and arising in the form of that wave. They are the manifestation of the reality of the body of water. We now add a further element to this metaphor, the element of interaction. The body of water forms the waves that appear on its surface, and the waves deform, in turn, the body of water. So the waves are transforming the whole ocean to arise in the form of the wave. Here, the body of the wave is the akasha, deeper, whatever you want to call it, A dimension, and the waves, quantum vacuum, and the waves that appear on its surface are events in the M dimension, manifestation. Well, our physical aspect, our physical manifestation, are surface manifestations in the manifest realm of the ocean that we're all unique emergences of. So you can say each one of our souls is a unique way that the totality, the universe with a capital U, or God, has of emerging into manifest existence, so that the totality can know itself through the way that we know the totality, or through the way we know God, God knows of him, herself. So this is one that is going to take some thinking about to really digest, but it's really important. So do you understand what I'm saying? We're not... sometimes the souls are just described as kind of these generic containers for pure spirit. And then ultimately the souls merge back into the divine, and there's no separation. But with what even Arby is saying, that each soul has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom, I would say that each of our souls is a unique enabler of a particular way of relationship between our soul and everything else. So it's kind of like what sometimes is called the signature of the soul, or the way that we know it's still us. Well, just take an example through our physical lifetime. You ask a 3-year-old, who are you? And what's the 3-year-old going to say? I'm me. Look at you like, what's wrong with you? And if we think back through our life, well, certainly our understanding has changed, our personality has changed, our emotions have changed. Physically, we've certainly changed, but you can ask anyone that same question throughout their life, and they're going to always say, I'm me. So we've got that essence of identity that persists even though the outward form's changed. And physically, all the cells in our body, many of them are replaced every 7 days, but I think by every 7 years there's no cells in our body that are the same as what was there before. And when we're in deep sleep, we're not conscious of anything. So here's a question that arises, well, where are we stored when we're in deep sleep, so when we wake up, we know it's us and we have an identity? Well, thank goodness we do. I have slim attendance if that was the case. And you might have trouble understanding me. Okay. So many of the things of what I'm saying today, and I'm going to try to kind of go through and summarize some of the key points that I've presented, are, you could say, seed thoughts. And you don't have to get all of them. If you even take one of them and really work with it or reflect on it, then maybe it'll help trigger off an awakening, or at least a curiosity to look at things in a different way. Okay? So let me go on. So the spirituality that I'm talking about and that Sufis talk about is, the point is for the divine awakening in life. And what that means is to become grounded in the true reality in which we exist, not spaced out. The point is not to just put our consciousness up on the transcendent at the expense of the manifest. And some of you might remember the spirituality of the 60s and 70s, and it was all about just getting really high, and getting blissed out and getting to cosmic states of consciousness, and it was lots of fun, very enjoyable, but it was not at all functional in life, and it wasn't going to bring about good things happening in our own life unless you had somebody just to take care of you while you sat there blissing out. And it certainly wasn't going to bring about a change in the conditions of the world, which I think is something that we care about. So I think we'd like to have a spirituality that's firmly grounded in manifestation, but here I want to say not a limited cross-section of manifestation, because what we usually think of, experience, and know of in manifestation, like I said, is just the thinnest cross-section, oftentimes a distorted cross-section of the way that the reality really is. And I've talked before about William Tiller's research on subtle energy, in which he theorizes and has demonstrated by experiment whenever there's something that links or brings a subtle energy into ordinary reality, the properties of physics change, and now there's things possible that weren't possible before. Well, that's a really wonderful physical explanation for that. But I would say on the spiritual side, whenever we do that, and it's not by shipping pieces of circuit board off somewhere else, although, I mean, this is such wonderful research that he's done. But the way we do that is through our life experiences, when we experience a real sense of presence with whatever it is that we're experiencing. And it's certainly furthered by practices that we might do in our spiritual work. Because think of anything that any of you have studied to have the careers that you've had. You had to go to school, you had to learn a lot of things, you had to go to laboratories and things like that. But our society is one in which it just wants, there's a tendency to want instant results, especially in spirituality. So it's like, oh, I don't want to have to work that out, do all that. Just, show me what to do, and I just want to get there. Well, the example, I'll give two examples I used in therapy with my clients when I could tell they were, let's say they came in really depressed and they were wanting 2 weeks later just to feel wonderful. I'd say, well, okay, let's say you want to bake a cake, and it says bake at 350 for an hour, but you're in a hurry and go, I don't want to wait an hour. I'm going to put it at 700. It'll be ready in 30 minutes. No. And let's say you want to grow some roses, and it says, well, these are going to take you, the first year you won't get any blossoms, but by the second year you have beautiful roses. And you go, 2 years, I want this to look pretty, so I'm just going to dump a whole bag of fertilizer on them. That's going to speed things up, right? No. So there is a natural process to growth, and there's kind of like the natural process that will happen even if you don't do anything about it, but that's not the best way to get there. So if you wanted to get to a place you hadn't been, you could just start walking in a direction you thought it was in and, ask somebody here or there, but you'd be a lot better off getting a map or GPS and, having available some guidance, from some instructions about how to get there. So different spiritual systems have developed what I would call technologies for awakening. And they've been time-tested sometimes for hundreds or thousands of years. And it is not necessary to adopt all the beliefs and imagery and whatever of a particular system in order to benefit from at least some of the practices of that. For instance, Buddhism has wonderful practices helping towards awakening. And you don't have to concentrate on beautiful mandalas or doing all the prostrations, but that's a part of someone that's just seriously wanting to get into certain Buddhist schools, which is fine. But the point I'm making is there's a lot of techniques that can help us develop a clarity of consciousness, to help us focus, to help us deepen our capacity for understanding, and also through experiences of deep meditation practices to expand our scope of being able to be really present to ourselves, to a higher reality, to people that we interact with. And when we do that, we're enabling this linkage of the subtle and the manifest. And the short way of describing all that is we're bringing about our awakening in a transformed world, that we literally, through our own practices, can reach a condition or state of being where the world that we're in is very different than it was to start with, but we're not spaced out. People are not going, what's the matter with you? I mean, we're just, at Hazrat Inayat Khan said, it takes a heavy ship to navigate, the ocean. So we want to have that firm grounding. And Ram Dass, that many of you may be familiar with, wonderful teacher, said you can get as high as you want as long as you still know your zip code. So again, I want to emphasize that the point of spirituality is not to get very spaced out. It's not to walk around being some stereotype of holiness. It's not to develop psychic or occult powers. And Hazrat Inayat Khan said it's also not to become an angel. He says the souls along the journey towards manifestation could always decide, well, angelic realm is fine, I'm just going to get off here. But we decided we wanted to go on and see what was out there, so here we are. The point of spirituality is to become an authentic human being, a natural human being. And most people these days are in a far cry from a natural state of being. And that doesn't mean you have to turn into Thoreau and go live in a cabin in the woods. You can be a natural human being in the thick of the city and work and relationships and taxes and everything else, even politics, although that's more challenging, that's more advanced training. But it's to become something that enables us to be much more functional in the world and not just coping with it, because many times people are attracted to spirituality for stress management, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's always something that gets us motivated to start with. Sometimes it's a crisis or a loss or something has shattered our belief system, but something has been the impetus, but that doesn't need to be the final word. So it may start with that and go, okay, I've learned to get very relaxed, but it'd be like if you went on a vacation to a beautiful place. You might like to spend part of it just lying in a hammock, but you probably want to get out and explore too and see the sights. Okay. All right, onward. I talked about something called Bekenstein's bound, and what that means is he proved that if you have any kind of interface, which could be like a screen or a computer monitor, and there's something on the other side of the monitor, and there's you on this side, there's a finite limit to how much information can be communicated back and forth. And it could be God on the other side. Well, this is my add-on to Bekenstein. Both sides still are bound by this finite limit to how much can come through either way, but the capacity for the amount of information that can go in either direction is directly related to the size of the screen. Well, that doesn't mean go out and get a 72-inch TV, although maybe you want to do that, but that's not going to quite get you there. How do we increase the size of the screen? Well, we're increasing our capacity for awakening to the many levels on which we exist. So like stage one would be being able to do something that's going to bring a linkage of the subtle and the manifest. And once we do that, now there's possibilities that couldn't have happened before. And a much more advanced level would be awakening to our consciousness on the multiple levels of reality on which we already exist, but our consciousness is embryonic on most of them. So just like the infant comes into life with all the possibilities of being able to make sense of its environment, it has to go through some trial and error and learn how to manipulate its own body and learn how to reach for objects and learn that there's object permanence and so on. And then later, I've talked before about Piaget's stages of cognitive development. You can't teach an infant how to do abstract reasoning. Or you can't even really teach a 5-year-old how to do abstract reasoning because their brains haven't matured to the point where that's a possibility. It doesn't mean they're not going to be able to arrive at that. Well, similarly, through spiritual processes, we have the capacity to awaken to many levels of existence on which we already exist, and I would say that would be part one. And part two would be, well, Pure Belial call this toggling. So many mystics say, well, we have an angelic existence all the time. In fact, our angelic body is bigger, much bigger than our physical body. So stage one would be awakening to our angelic aspect and kind of toggling consciousness back and forth between that and physical manifestation. And a further stage would be awakening to other levels on which we exist, but keeping all of those going at the same time, because, okay, I've got my head, I've got my hand, I've got my foot, and so on, but I don't think that these are separate things, and they're all related to each other. They're coordinated with each other. So we can develop what I call multimodal consciousness, a state of being in which we're very grounded in our physical manifestation, but we're also aware of ourselves as being a much vaster being than that. And when we do that, and when we can be fully present with whatever it is that we're doing, whether it's outward in the world with other people, or whether it's in our meditation with higher states of our own being, now we're enabling possibilities to arise that couldn't happen otherwise. Okay, so let me pause here because I've given you a yes.
John, kind of thinking about both of those aspects. It seems to me that at times there are circumstances which actually does allow you to bake your cake at 700 degrees and get a good cake in 30 minutes. I'm thinking about like children who have been given a terminal diagnosis that seem to have a kind of wisdom that adults, don't have access to. And in circumstances in their life, to compress that kind of access.
Okay, this is a very good question. The question is, there's times when we can bake the cake at 700 degrees and we have access to things we don't usually have access to. And oftentimes, those happen during times of trauma or crisis. Well, if you're, well, I'll give an extreme example. If you're in a life-threatening situation, you're probably not going to be worrying too much about an IRS audit. I mean, it's like, and it forces you to dampen down the usual way of thinking and perceiving, and when that happens, it's natural that you are opened up to a deeper state of relationship with everything else, and then information can come through much more clearly. So many times when people talk about intuition in religions, sometimes described as a still small voice. And what does that mean? It means it's quiet, it's subtle, it's not blaring out, and usually it's covered up by the loud voices of just reaction and kind of going, now that's not really the case. But when that other way of thinking is out of the way through some heavy-duty circumstance, something that takes you out of your usual state of consciousness enables you to have what the Sufis call a hal, H-A-L, which means a temporary raising of consciousness to a higher state. And so you are able to perceive things in a very different light. But then generally after that circumstance is over, you come back down and then you try to figure out how can I get back to that condition. But you mentioned like a child with a terminal illness having a wisdom. Well, young children in particular are naturally much closer to that original way of connection with the totality, which gets unlearned as children get older, and especially when they start sharing things that they've imagined and they get told, oh, that's just ridiculous, and then, that's not the way things are. And then the child either learns, don't tell anybody about it, or that must not be real, and then they learn how to get into the usual dualistic state of consciousness that's validated by most of the people on Earth. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. Okay, some more points that I've made in the earlier classes. We live in a non-dualistic, interconnected reality, despite the fact that to our senses and to our usual thinking, it is dualistic and we're separated. So even if we can't see it and don't believe it, we still are in a non-dualistic, interconnected reality, which extends far beyond the world of the physical senses and our concepts and usual emotions. Okay? Nothing is static. It's the nature of life to continually undergo self-organization to higher states. We experience chaotic shifts, which your question was about, John, I think, which the Sufis call a shattering of the usual way of seeing things to emerge in the next station, which the Sufis call maqam, and that awakening in that higher station is called baqa. So we're going through this breaking down of the old forms and then this chaotic intermediate period to organize to a higher way. And if we look back at the discontinuities in our life, the discontinuities in our ways of thinking and emotionally relating to things, our life's journey probably wasn't this linear, smooth thing. So we're like, whoa, this thing happened, and then went through this very difficult period, and then what emerged was something that was much more deeply integrated than what was there before. But that couldn't happen without going through that intermediate chaotic period. That usually we're thinking, how can I make this chaos go away? Well, back to an example I made in an earlier class, the caterpillar being self-aware and spinning the cocoon and realizing that it's dissolving and go, wait a minute, I want to go back to being a caterpillar, but it's emerging to a butterfly. I mean, that process is underway. It's going to happen, and it'd be a lot better off just going, okay, take a little break here, and I'll get to fly at the other side of it. A term that I mentioned before that came, I think, from Laszlo that I just love is trans-universe inheritance. And remember in some of the early classes I talked about the theories that we live in a multiverse, that our universe is not the only universe, that the Big Bang was not the only Big Bang, and there's untold numbers of universes being created and destroyed. And one of the theories, which makes all kinds of sense to me, is when one universe ends up being destroyed, or what might happen in a black hole is that the information that goes into that black hole reemerges out of a white hole into a new universe. And so nothing is lost in the information from a previous universe. It actually becomes the seed information of the new universe. And this is one possible explanation for why all the constants of physics, if they weren't so precise, sometimes to 14 decimal places, there couldn't be life at all. There couldn't even be sometimes stars or a manifest universe. And then their theories are, well, this is just, there's so many of them, it had to randomly be this one, but it's just inconceivable that there'd be this many, this precise. So to me, a much more believable explanation is that there was lots and lots of other universes, and the ones that worked seeded their information into the ones that came after, and we ended up with this one in which life is possible and consciousness is possible and human beings are possible, and undoubtedly many other forms of life, other places that we'll discover when we have the technology. So we have a trans-universe inheritance. So if you want a far-out inspiration from meditation, just think about that. I mean, the mystics talk about the divine inheritance, and that's pretty easy to think about. Well, this is what God kind of gave each of us in our souls, the divine qualities. But with that, think about all the information that is part of our, you could say, our cosmic DNA that we collectively have inherited from untold universes that existed before this one. Pretty cool thought, I think. So I mentioned this before too, the general idea or common idea in Hinduism is Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, creator, preserver, destroyer. These cycles or kalpas, they're called, or yugas of creation and destruction that last 10 billion years each. But generally the way that's described is that the manifestation is just the play of God. It gets all wiped out. It's like those etch-a-sketches. You did this wonderful picture and then someone comes along and goes, your picture is gone. But with this, which again to me makes so much more sense, because for one, what a waste if all these things went on, and just think of all the beauty and the wisdom that's been gained just on Earth so far, and imagine if all that just disappeared and it was back to the drawing board the next time there was a new universe. Wouldn't it be nice if all that was, think about going to school. Imagine if every 10 years or so, all the information that previously existed was wiped out from the internet, but also the memory banks of everybody, and there was still enough left for life support. Let's say you still knew how to do farming and so on, and then you had to redevelop everything all over again. Talk about a ecological waste of resources. That would not be good recycling. Okay. So, what is the spiritual path? Well, that's a question for each of us to ask ourselves. But one way of thinking about it is the spiritual path is a process of learning to shift our vantage point and our capability to have a much fuller way of relationship with everything. And that includes whatever you think of God or the rest of the universe or everything in manifestation. What begins as a journey of an individual in the process of transformation becomes the realization that each of us is an integral part of a much larger evolving reality. Hazar and Khan said the spiritual journey requires unlearning. That doesn't mean developing amnesia, but it means freeing ourselves from a limited, conditioned vantage point. Okay? Yes?
Could you elaborate, since we've been talking about practices, and I've been working with practices with people, how those practices function in softening that self that can't see these larger perspectives, and even phenomena, as you're talking about, breaking down the old forms.
Okay. Well, I can get into that just a bit. One would be, and I think one of the easiest practices for people to experience is just to concentrate on the energy field or the magnetic field of your being, and then with a breath practice, and I think we might have done this in one of the earlier ones, you imagine that there's compasses around you, and as you exhale, you're extending your magnetic field, and it's deflecting the compass needles in one direction. As you inhale, you're bringing it back in. And I've never met anybody who couldn't experience that practice, and then you gradually put the compasses further and further away. Well, usually at the end of that practice, people feel, oh, I feel so much bigger. You don't feel like you stop at your skin. So this is a very basic practice that helps people to realize that we are much more than just the physical aspect of ourselves, that we do, and similarly with light practices, that we have an aura that extends beyond our being, and we can increase the amount of light that emanates from our being by doing some very simple kinds of practices. These are very easy for people to experience. And so when someone experiences these things, they go, okay, well, I don't quite know how this all works, but yeah, it makes sense to me. There's more to the way things are than I thought they were. And then just asking them questions like, have you ever been in some gorgeous place in nature, the Grand Canyon in Yosemite, where you had this sense of awe and you were just transported, and what did the world seem like? And oh, it felt so vast and it felt timeless. Well, your perception shifted by a way that you had of plugging into something in your surrounding. And then there's many practices with sound, and the Sufis called wazifa, other traditions called mantra, and so on, that have been tested over the centuries that the vibration of the practice has an effect on our being. And there have been laboratory experiments to show that experienced meditators can increase the amount of photons that are emanated. So one way related to your question is just to do what I've been doing in this series of classes, share research with people to show that it's possible through spiritual practices, even the one about the physics experiment where meditators were able to alter the two-slit experiment from a distance just by their consciousness. Consciousness is having an effect on the physical apparatus at a distance. The world must be different than I think. And then you get just even hearing about those things, if they trigger off a sense of wonder in you, that opens up a door, so you don't have to have a crisis to open up that door. It opens up a door to understanding and a desire to discover, well, how might things be different? And if there's no receptivity to learning, then the spiritual path is not going to do any good at all. And there's a story of a guru who one of the students said, "Teacher, I've been with you for all these years and I still don't have this God realization that other people have gotten." And the teacher went over and touched a cow and raised the cow's kundalini, and like the cow, I guess, became the illuminated cow. And the teacher said, if there's no receptivity, then even God himself, if he came, couldn't bring about this. We have to, that's part of having free will. We have to have an openness and a receptivity to discover. And you may remember the story I told about William Tiller presenting his research on subtle energy at the conference, and the experienced physicist next to him said to Tiller, even if what you're saying is true, I don't believe it. So, I mean, if someone is that closed-minded, then, I would say to them, well, take cruises, enjoy yourself, have a nice life, and I won't bother getting into debates with you, because who wants to get into a debate anyway? If they're not wanting to learn something, then you take your business to somebody that's wanting to learn. So, okay. Yes.
Kind of flipping the example that you just gave, going back to the realization about the awareness of a small child. There's a story about a small boy listening to the story of the virgin birth, in which he comments that has to be true, even if it never happened.
That's good. So, well, children have that openness to magical thinking.
He said that is so beautiful, it has to be true, even if it never happened.
Okay. Well, the comment was of a child saying the story of the virgin birth has to be true because it's so beautiful, even if it hadn't happened. Well, let me shift to something I think I mentioned before in physics. A physicist named Murray Gell-Mann, I think this was back in the 60s, there weren't all the subatomic particles known that have been discovered since, but some of them were known. And he looked at what was known, and he was trying to make sense, well, what's the order of these? What kind of pattern do they fit in? And there was some mathematical group that if there were, I'll just say 3 more things that had these properties, it would fit into this beautiful mathematical group. And so he hypothesized, I think that you're going to eventually discover these other 3 because this is so beautiful, it has to be this way. And lo and behold, years later, they had the technology to discover that. So I think that's a pretty good pull about, and I think some of the theories in physics, I mean, they're so complicated, there's got to be a simpler thing that's going to be discovered someday. I mean, there has to be, and a lot of physicists say that it's got to be something beautiful. And some of the most wonderful theories in mathematics and physics are just beautiful. I ended up majoring in mathematics in college, besides psychology, not because I was ever planning to be a mathematician for a living, but when I got to some of the higher order classes in mathematics, it was so beautiful. I mean, it was like art or poetry or music, and it's like, well, I just want to learn some more about this. This is just amazing. So, okay, well, let me go on a bit because we don't have too much more time. Well, a story I mentioned earlier about the purpose is not to acquire occult powers. There's a story about a student of a guru who told his teacher that he'd been working for years, and he demonstrated. He'd learned to walk on water, and he walked across the river. And the teacher turned to him and he says, well, your years of practices and meditations are worth exactly 2 rupees, which is what it costs to pay the ferryman to take you across the river. Okay. So practices help us to break free from our usual perspective and to access higher states of being, and eventually to remain in these higher states. And higher, I want to emphasize again, does not mean spaced out. Maybe a better term is more expansive states of being, more and more of the time still firmly grounded in the manifest world. Hazrat Khan said, may the heavens be reflected on earth, Lord, that the earth may turn into heaven. And in the Zoroastrian tradition, the teenagers, when they take a pledge, it's kind of their initiation rite, to work to bring about the transfiguration of the archangel of the earth. Same idea. It's to really bring about a transformation that is way beyond anything that we can usually conceive of about, well, I mean, definitely we need to do something about global warming, and all that is great, but the kinds of problems that have been in the world for so many years are not going to really change on a deep level until I think there's a general shift in consciousness of many, many, many people. And then that's going to enable possibilities to happen that aren't there. So in a way, Pierre Belite gave a wonderful talk, I think about 20 years ago probably, where he talked about the spirituality of the future. Well, I would say we are in that future, and the spirituality of the future is one that has to make sense, that can't have this dichotomy between mysticism and science, that there has to be a way of having, of understanding reality that fits from both perspectives, even though the language and metaphors are different, and each of those two has something to contribute to the other. I would say that a large portion of what I've gained in spirituality over the decades has been because of my interest in science and my quest to try to see how things would plug together. And oftentimes in my meditation, my practice is to sit with a question, like, how does this fit? So without going into detail, because I don't have time by any means, my latest quest I'm exploring is what if there's something that we could call spiritual DNA, and what if each soul embodies a unique quantum information processing field that is able to tap into the akasha, or the totality of information in a unique way, and not only understand things differently, but bring forth new information, and even more so in connection with others. And then I'll just sit with that, put that question out, and sit and wait for inspiration to come. I don't go, well, let's see, it'd be like this or that, because great breakthroughs in science have not come through more of the usual way of thinking. It's come through some inspiration, like the structure of benzene was discovered when a chemist just was sitting, I think, in front of a fire and just had this dancing image of I think it was snakes kind of going around in a pattern. He figured, oh, it must be a ring-shaped structure. That's why it's this way. And Einstein's great discoveries were thought experiments. Like, well, what if you could be traveling at the speed of light in a ship this way and another one passed you that way? What would happen to the clocks and so on? So the last plug I want to put in is something that the Sufis term creative imagination. And this is not fantasy. This is using the power of our consciousness, I would say, combined with presence and a linking of subtle and more manifest to envision new possibilities. It's like what gets seeded in the new instance of creation that emerges at every instant. And it's triggered by our desire that is carried through, our deep desire that's in alignment with the Sufis say the divine impulse that started that desire, but that desire has been transformed by our experience and so on. So we are, like I said earlier, we're all emergent avatars of the divine being, and that doesn't mean people are going to go around, oh, you know, you're God and I'm not. I'm just talking about becoming more and more fully capable of expressing the divinity of our being and the humanity of our being in relationship with each other, not either one lost in the other. I think that's why there's human beings to start with. So I think I will end on that.